Okay, let's start the afternoon session. So this is the first of our sessions on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And we've got two speakers this afternoon. The first of these speakers is Senthold Asseng. He's going to be talking about uncertainties of climate change impacts in agriculture, and you can see that he is part or the lead of a very, very large team who have contributed to this presentation. He's a professor at the Agricultural and Biological Engineering Department of the University of Florida. But specifically today, he's going to talk about the AgMIP project, in which he leads the wheat component of AgMIP. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Linda, for inviting me to this seminar. I hope there's some agricultural interested people in this room here. Anyone doing agricultural sciences, food security? 1, 2. I talked to 2 people. 3. Okay, cool. 4. So what I try to do is I touch things obviously related to uncertainty, which are very similar to what you heard already this morning. But we're looking now at impact models. You will see there are a lot of similarities, but there are also differences in there. I put a lot of names up here. It's sort of just to show off. These are all my friends, you know, as you do all your social things with having friends linked up. With these guys, we're having fun together by running models in a comparison mode. So we're doing model comparison, and these guys represent about now must be more than 80%, maybe 85% of all wheat crop models. So I'm working on a specific commodity, which is wheat, and there are about I think altogether maybe 33, 34 wheat models available in the world, and 30 now we have in this team, and we, as I said, we are friends and having fun together, which is very different than it used to be. Until recently, maybe a few years ago, we were all big competitors. My model was the best one, and I don't like yours because you do it this way and so on. This has changed now, and I think in a positive way that we start now learning from each other and hopefully improving not just my model, we're improving now different models, and we're all learning from this. I will talk about uncertainties of climate change in impacts in agriculture. What I want to do in the next 90 minutes, depending on how we go with questions, feel free to interrupt me anytime, as long as I get to my conclusions in the end, about 150 slides, if that's okay. Anyone listening? Oh, something is good. I'll tell you a bit about AgMIP. You can see already, CMIP, AgMIP, it's something very, very similar. I've been asked by the organizers to give some sort of a feeling for what these impact models do, and I thought I'd tell you a bit about the structure, and I go a bit deeper into one specific one, which is how we model CO2, which is actually done very similar and very different impact models as well. Then I talk about model uncertainty. That's about a paper I sent around looking at what is uncertainty, trying to quantifying it, trying to quantifying and determining the sources of uncertainty, and also looking at ways to reduce uncertainty. And I come up with two suggestions, and hopefully we get to the conclusion where I try to summarize this. AgMIP. AgMIP is an agriculture model intercomparison and improvement project. So it's very similar to the climate model intercomparison and improvement project, which has been initiated and started about 4 years ago by Cynthia Rosenzweig from NASA, which might be familiar to most of you, together with Jim Jones and Jim Jones from University of Florida. It's a colleague of mine at UF, and Jerry Hetfeld from USDA, and more recently, John Entel from OSU joined the leadership team for AgMIP. And what AgMIP tries to do in a nutshell is to improve the characterization of risk of hunger and world food security due to climate change, and to enhance, so first understand what climate change does, and to enhance adaptation capacity in both developing and developed countries. So really not just looking at a specific region, looking globally. AgMIP has a structure like this, where we have teams dealing with climate models, which feed information into crop models. And these information from crop models are also used for agriculture economic models. There's another layer behind there, which Katja, I think, will mention a few things about. AgMIP basically combines these three main sectors, the climate, crop, and economic models, in a multi-model approach. So up to recently, crop modelers use different GCMs, different scenarios, but often use just one single model. We didn't really know how much uncertainty comes from just using one model. So we're also using now more than one model, and you would see an example where we use more than 20 models. As I said, it started in 2010. It's open, everyone can join, everyone is welcome to sort of take initiative, try to lead something in there. It has now more than 600 members. It's really grown from nothing 4 years ago to 600 members, and about 30 different projects. And a nice summary paper is the one by Sentho, which came last year out in Agriculture, Forestry, and Meteorology. There are other activities around these core activities, and just to mention one more, a cost-cutting theme on uncertainty, which Linda is actually leading, which sort of goes across the different aspects within AgMIP as well. And one of the 30 projects I lead together now with two guys, one from Germany and one from France, which we call AgMIP Read, which brings together groups from all around the world, but you see it's very biased towards Europe and the US. We have no one representing Africa, for instance. We have very little representation from South America. These are all the modeling groups. You can see most read models have been and are still developed in Europe. Just to tell you a bit about a crop, what's going on there. So and it's not just for wheat. In general, a farmer sows the crop, puts it in the soil, it germinates, it grows, and at different stages it experiences climate. So we're not just interested in an average climate. We need to know what happened on a daily time step at these different phases. And if you get heat stress maybe here, might do less damage than getting heat stress somewhere in here. So the timing of these events can be very important. So we have a crop which develops over time, which does different things. It partitions carbohydrates, which plants accumulate through photosynthesis, into different parts, different organs, into the roots. So the roots connect the above ground part to uptake of water and nutrients. And again, some of them are related and influenced by climate as well. For instance, rainfall affecting saltwater content affecting where the nutrients are, for instance, in the system. So a crop model tries to simulate this. A crop model deals with the development of a crop at different stages. It's influenced often by daily climate information, including solar radiation, temperature, and most models deal with maximum temperature. Some of them break it further down in 3 hours or 1 hour time steps. And water, which can be rainfall. In agriculture, there are quite a few systems also irrigated. I think half of the wheat globally, of the production, comes from irrigated systems now. The farmer has quite a few options and does things also differently to it in terms of managing. He can sow it earlier, later. He has higher, lower plant densities, puts more or less nutrients out there. But he also chooses a genotype which interacts differently with these other factors in there as well. So the system we're looking at is this. I will tell you lots about wheat, but it applies to lots of other crops, agricultural crops as well. And one important one, I touched it a bit, the soil obviously is very important because quite a few of the climate factors are negotiated through the soil, like water, for instance. You might get lots of rainfall tomorrow, but nothing for the next 3 weeks, and you could have severe drought stress. Even if you had so much, but the soils couldn't hold it, or the roots are too short that they can't, too shallow to really access this. So what we usually concentrate in crop modeling, in crop models, on are points in the landscape where we have a phenotype, which is a representation of a genotype which is described on a much more finer level. But we often don't deal with that. We don't describe the genetics. We don't describe what's happening in the cell, for instance. But you're still able to describe what's happening at a point in the field. And I thought that's you think about it in one of the talks this morning. There seems to be a push for more detail. Also, we have the discussion in agriculture models. How much do we really need of this? Because there's a lot of detail here, which some of them we don't really understand. Does it help us to say something about the point? Which then interacts, which need to be able to interact with the environment and management. So we're concentrating on these points in landscapes. We're using, in an abstract way, information from much higher resolution information, which some of them are not that clear. We use these models at points, at fields, at farms. We go into regions, and you will hear more. Some of these models are taken to a global application as well. At the top there's one where we try to simulate wheat yields across the globe, wherever they grow wheat, for instance. But as I also mentioned, there is now quite a bit of interest to use these models to translate advances in genetics into there as well. So the crop model seems to be quite central in both ways, going globally to have an impact on global food security, but also helping huge investments right now into genetics of what might be needed to improve plant growth, to adapt to changes through climate change, which would come through the environment, and how should that be managed? Again, something which can be explored with these kind of models. Just to give you a rough idea of how most of these models work, that's one model I've worked with. So we have input information, data information on rainfall, maximum temperature, and solar radiation, which feed into a crop part. The crop part is cut down into different processes. The crop part interacts with the soil to take up water at different times from different layers. The soil water also interacts with soil nitrogen, the most important nutrient for plant growth. But if you want to do nitrogen, you also need to do carbon. So often if you have a soil nitrogen model, you have a soil nitrogen carbon module in there. There are a lot of different processes which interact with each other and affect how plants grow over time under different environments, different management, and so on. And what you can do is, this slide, I want to show you this one. I went once to a conference, it must be 10 years ago, and there was a statistician, and he had lots of data, and he had one slide similar. It wasn't this one, he didn't give it to me. He said, as you can see, as you can see. So the actual point I want to make here, with these models, with all the other models you have seen before, you can create lots of data. That's the easy part. Did you know that? That's my favorite slide here. As you can see. But there are a lot of other things to it as well. You can generate a lot of output, a lot of data by using a model, any model. But the inputs are playing a big role as well. And we touched that today as well, of what's driving uncertainty. It can be from within here and what sort of algorithm you have. But what we're also realizing, what you put in matters as well a lot. If you put rubbish in, don't expect your model sort of getting it straight and turns out the right results again. And often when you compare model results we do that by comparing it with field experiments, where we control most things and change one by one, and then we try to simulate next to it with a model and see if we can reproduce that. Often we end up that the simulation outputs are different to the observed one. And there are a lot of things which can go wrong before you can blame the model. Of course, the model can be wrong as well, but I'd like to sort of point out that there are other aspects as well, and other aspects very important, and one of them are inputs, and they relate to wrong inputs. And it might sound trivial, and you see some more. If you had more time, I can go through the literature and showing where people published things, where do these things wrong and come up with wrong conclusions for that. Wrong inputs is applies to all models. Wrong or poor estimates for inputs are when you don't have measurements for it. You start estimating it, and your estimate is then sort of defining of what's coming out of your model. Wrong inputs, I think there are a lot of issues with climate data as well, and we haven't heard much today about it. When I worked in Australia for many years, I asked once the climate scientists give me the highest quality temperature data out of the 4,000 stations they had. And I'd like to have them in the wheat belt. And it turned out there were 20 high-quality temperature data sets at this time, probably more now, and only 6 of them were within the wheat belt. So when you really want to have good input data, even for climate information, that can be very limited information out there. If you don't have them, if you might not even have a station, you have to estimate them, then you really need to be aware that your inputs could drive a lot of things which are coming through you as well. You can have wrong observations in both ways, where you compare things with, and the climate one would be an example as well. And with these wrong observations, all these things, I mean, they're all simplistic, but I've seen them, and some of them I've seen published. All these things can happen where you have wrong numbers, wrong units. There's a paper out there I could show you where someone looked through a simulation we did once and said, this can't be right, your water use efficiency is wrong. I said, oh, did we really overlook something there? And it turned out he got the wrong numbers out of a table. Instead of looking at our yield, this group looked at our biomass. So they got a water use efficiency which was much too high for any yield because he did it wrong. And they published it, and it's out there now saying we did something wrong with our model, but all they did something wrong with these simple things. So again, all these different things matter when it gets in there, and if you're sure that all these things are put into the model in the right way, then I think it's also time, of course, the model and the routines can be wrong. We should look at this as well. But what I've seen often in agriculture models, without considering any of that, the conclusion from that is always the model doesn't work, the model is wrong. Okay, so I give you a quick, brief example about modeling CO2 for those of you who might not know. Plants doing photosynthesis, which you're aware of, which is done by taking up CO2 through stomata, which are on the undersides of most leaves. At the same time, the plant takes CO2 in for photosynthesis. It releases water, and in the cells, it turns in a quite complicated process into carbohydrates together with light. There are different stages. There's a light stage and a dark phase in there. The main thing which comes out there, you use CO2, use some water, this light turns into carbohydrates, energy, which can be then used for growing things, for maintaining cells, for creating gradients, for uptake, and so on. It releases obviously some oxygen and a bit of water, but the main thing in here is every time you want to take CO2 up into the cells, you also lose water through transpiration. And for growth, quite a few years ago, quite some decades ago, Montes discovered there's a very simple relationship between how much biomass you can grow in relation to intercepted radiation, which is sort of linear for different species. This is done here for apples, barley, potato, and sugar beet. So with a single parameter, you can transfer light into biomass. This has been also shown in this book chapter more recently for a single crop groundnut for different genotypes. It seems to be consistent across most of the cultivars or genotypes within the species. So having this knowledge, having this very simple way of translating radiation into biomass, probably most models have a simple radiation use efficiency approach where this is just a parameter which translates intercepted radiation assimilation and then distributes things to the different organs and respiration and so on. When we want to take into account elevated CO2, then again, empirically, we know what's happening is that if the concentration of CO2 is higher out there, you don't need to take so much CO2 up. So the plants often, under higher CO2, close slightly the stomata, taking less up because the concentration is higher. At the same time, they're losing less water through transpiration. What you then see when you measure that in the field, when you observe that with higher elevated CO2, with outside higher CO2 concentration, the radiation use efficiency, UE, seems to increase. And at the same time, the transpiration efficiency decreases. So by including, this is my only equation I show you today, when you try to calculate the growth on a particular day, for instance, we can translate the incoming radiation, which is here, depending on how much you intercept. So it's a bit more complicated if you're growing a canopy. A certain proportion is intercepted. This is basically the intercepted incoming light. It's translated to via radiation use efficiency through a constant, because it's constant for a crop, into growth. And then it can be manipulated with a factor which has been established from a range of controlled environment experiments, where you can see that with increasing atmospheric CO2 concentration, you multiply something higher than 1, you basically increase the radiation use efficiency. For mouse crops, this factor, these manipulations also slightly changes with temperature. So if you're in a hotter environment, the radiation use efficiency would increase more compared to a cool environment. These are environments which are possible, for instance, for wheat. So in a very simplistic way, without describing the complexity of photosynthesis, a lot of models translate light via a constant into growth and use a factor to manipulate, for instance, effects of that CO2, which are obviously important if you want to look at climate change impact studies. Yes.
Do you have crop models which are including aerosol or other things in the radiation use efficiency in this way, such that
that's
take advantage of
some of them actually more complicated by changing the radiation use efficiency with incoming light to take into account cloud cover. So if you have low radiation levels, you often have clouds which transmit light into the canopy, which then increases radiation use efficiency. And the same applies, we've done a study for China, where in some regions the incoming radiation has been reduced, I think, by more than 30% due to particles in there, which not directly translate all in a reduced rate, because you get increased radiation use efficiency because of the scattering of the light into the canopy, you get some increases in radiation use efficiency as well. So this is the simplest version, and there are models which take these the particles in the air into account as well. And what you can do with crop models, which is a bit different to climate models, where you have one realization. If you want to test your climate model globally, you have one realization of the global climate. Whereas with models which work at different points, you can actually go to these different points across the world, do experiments which are well managed and carefully carried out in a way that you change one thing at a time and see if the models can actually do that. And later on, you can also do it more complicated. You overlap the different things. You will see that in a moment. And in the 90s, people started doing field experiments under open air with increased CO2. These are big plastic pipes. This is a wheat field. Might be hard to see. I think the biggest ones went up to 30 meters, and they blow elevated CO2 into these rings. So they increase constantly the CO2 levels within these rings under open field conditions to mimic what we might see in the next 40, 50 years. They did these experiments for dry conditions where they reduced the water supply, they give it enough water, and they did other things to it, but one by one to really see what's going on. And a major directional changes are shown here. These are observed data. If you have a dry crop, this is done in Arizona. You can only grow crops under irrigation. I think they used half of the irrigation they usually had. You still get a crop of 6 tons. But if you put CO2 on it, so the only difference between these two yields is one of them has higher CO2. I think it's 550 parts per million compared to about 360 in the 90s, I think. You get a huge increase in yield. If you are growing a crop under wet conditions, you grow a larger crop. You can see this is just because you have more water there. But the impact of CO2 is smaller as well. Try to show this roughly with these errors. So dry conditions, huge impact. Wetter conditions, still a positive impact, smaller. If you have limited other conditions like nitrogen is the main part of it, in this experiment, I think statistically was not different there. There was no CO2 effect because something else was limiting. In this case, nitrogen was limiting the effect of CO2. When we then run a simulation model, that's one of the models we used in the past. You can see we are not blue are all the simulations when we are not spot on here. I need to put some error bars in there, some noise in here as well. But what we get right is that we get the biggest effect under the dry conditions. We get a smaller effect in here. And when it comes to nitrogen, the model even suggests there's a slight decrease in yield with higher CO2. So the model seems to overdo the impact of CO2 when it comes to restricted nitrogen supply. And that's one way of comparing. And there are data out there which you can use to validate. We also talked about validation this morning. If these models work for these different conditions, we could even take these models with some of these experiments. These are very expensive experiments. I think they are now maybe for wheat at least 4 or 5 around in the world. There could be a dozen happening now somewhere in the world. China does quite a few of them. There's one in Australia going on for a few years. Japan does 1 or even 2 on rice. In Germany, there's 1. So different countries doing these experiments now. Again, a big reason for these experiments is to see, can these models actually deal with future CO2 concentrations? Let's get me to uncertainty. Yeah.
I was just wondering whether then, if you think about the implications of that globally, whether that means, or I don't know if there are enough studies to say this conclusively, whether that means that developing countries that would be more likely to be nitrogen limited would be more than likely to be adversely affected and less likely to reap benefits from CO2 fertilization.
This is a very good question. There's a lot of discussion for the last few years now about Africa. How can production be increased in Africa? And a lot of breeding moves, for instance, in there, and they try to solve things with breeding. But the biggest limitation there, I think, is poor soil fertility, which relates to fertilizer, and very little fertilizer because they just can't afford fertilizer. So if your crop is limited by other things, the positive effect of CO2 won't be happening there at all.
Are there other plants that are nitrogen fixing that would also benefit from the CO2, or like crop alternations? I mean, maybe this is like way getting ahead of where we need to be.
I think it's a good question. There are other ways to get nitrogen in the system to grow legumes, for instance, which fix nitrogen, which respond to CO2. It hasn't been done. I don't know. There have been some soil experiments on this phase, and there's a positive effect in there because they are usually not limited by nutrients, but by nitrogen. But what I said for nitrogen as the biggest or most important nutrient, the other nutrients as well. If any of the others are missing, again, you would not see the CO2 effect the way we have described it here. So if you want to get this positive effect, you need to get the other factors right as well. And coming back to Africa, you could probably easily double production by just getting more fertilizer out. If you want to get quick changes.
The field experiment that you showed looks at only elevated CO2 levels. Does it also consider variation in temperature and precipitation?
So during this field experiment, it was out in open air, so you had the radiation as it came from the sun, changing over time. There's very little rain in this environment, so it will be almost full radiation almost every day. Temperature plays a role in there as well. But then they changed it in a strategic way that they have once with the CO2 and once without the CO2 to really sort of bring it down to what is the impact just from CO2. Then they overlaid it with water and nutrients to see what are the interactive effects. But there are many more, and people start looking at other interactions as well. So yes, I mean, this is one experiment under a certain environment. There's been question of if the CO2 affects how it's in other environments as well. That's how they justified 10 years ago to repeat some of these experiments in Australia, where the yields start at 1 ton or 2 tons. And what they see now there, because it's often water limited, you get larger effects there because this sort of interaction with water plays a big role. And the big effect through transpiration and transpiration efficiency comes through in there as well. But there's still a lot of things not clear when it comes to CO2 because these experiments are huge, they're expensive, they need a lot of investment, and need actually really good experimentalists to carry them through and understand what's going on there. Let's move into uncertainty. So in the past, we used, we had maybe one climate model, but for many years, impact modelers started using more than one because we became aware of that there's uncertainty of what these data are, what these scenarios are, right? So you have having different outputs, which are then used to be going through one impact model. And they give you results depending, they differ due to what's coming in terms of the scenarios supplied from the climate models. When you do the same thing and put this through a different impact model, and just by putting these errors a bit different, what I want to integrate in there, you can get a very different result. The question is now, why should I believe this impact over this impact? So it comes to the same thing which we have in climate modeling. How certain are we about them? And one way is obviously to do if we compare them with data, but another way is to compare them with each other. So we have climate models, we also have scenarios behind, if you forget about this for a moment. This impact model issue applies to crop models, but also other models. I understand there are a few dealing with hydrology, probably when we talk about biodiversity models, or even when you look at health models. There are quite a few different models which all deal with the same issue, where you translate climate information through an impact model into impacts. And it doesn't stop there. I won't talk much about it, but it goes on, where these information then are flowing into a next impact model. And in agriculture, in particular on AgMIP, we are realizing that that these information are used for economic models. And these economic models are used for making policies these days. So what we do here becomes now quite important, because a lot of lives could, for instance, depend on it if you get this wrong in terms of how will agriculture change in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Again, I think Katja will talk a bit about economic models later on. So there has been recently a nice study where the group around Andy Schellner summarized all the impact model studies which have been published in the last, I think, 10 or 15 years. They did it for different crops. I pulled the one out for wheat. They did it also, they separated to have, to be aware that there are at least two big differences in terms of where you grow crops. They looked at the temperate region and the tropics and subtropics. I put one figure out there to make one point. So first you can see there have been a lot of studies there. They plotted the impact as % yield change. So this is for wheat. They separated no adaptation, and then when they applied adaptation, and they plotted them over local mean temperature change. So if someone did an experiment where they increased the temperature by 2 degrees, they plotted them around here and see, okay, you get this response. And if you look at them, let's pick around 2 degrees. From these studies, the impacts could be a positive 40% increase in yield. And again, the other extreme, you could get a 40% decrease in yield. So what it actually shows, what we've done in the past, we generated a lot of information, but we don't really know what's behind there. They're not comparable. And if you put this to a policy maker and say, do something, adapt to it, what do? Do you adapt to this, or it's all over the place? And it's all over the place due to two things. And we don't know from these studies how much these two components contribute. One is uncertainty. These studies, this probably used a different model than this. Is this difference due to using a different model? Or is it due to this has been done on a different soil, had a different nitrogen application, had a different management? We don't know. The second part I just said has to do with natural variability in there, which is, it's out there. There's a lot of variability. Things are very different at different locations. But on top of it, there are a lot of different models used in here, which add to the uncertainty. And in here we don't know which ones, what is uncertainty and what is actually caused by natural variability. These are studies. They talk about 200 studies for no adaptation and 120 studies for with adaptation. There could be some of the studies did different temperatures, so there could be all one model, for instance. We don't know from then you would have, it would be just related to one model. But then you could also, this point, and this might be different because you did something else different there. And on top of it, the model was different. So you don't know from this study what differed there. And therefore, we don't know what's in here due to uncertainty and what's due to natural variability. Are you allowed to ask the question?
Yes. I'm allowed to ask.
She needs a mic. Next.
So just to be clear, in these experiments, only temperature was changed, correct?
I I think so. I think so. Say that again? I think they are both, I think, but most of the studies have been done with process-based models. Statistics. That's another complication in there as well.
So this figure says, oh, there's all this variability, but in these simulated results. But does the article go on to, I mean, it almost seems irresponsible to me to only stop there. If you don't go on and say, well, these models differ in this way, or the conclusion could be, and these models really should be similar. You know, we would expect them to be so. So this variability is really meaningful versus this variability occurs because these models are from this kind of blah, blah, blah. You know.
You should read the article. So they acknowledge some of these differences, but it's impossible to separate between natural variability and uncertainty, because all these studies have been done with a single model. Some of them, as I said, it's a single model across here, then there's another single model going across here, and some of them might be just one point in here. So we don't really, because there's been no proper comparison between different models. That's what I want to get to, where we keep the inputs the same and use different models and see how much actually these models cause problems in there. And you will see there's a lot of this could be due to uncertainty by using a different model. But that's how we have operated in the past, where some of these points are probably my ones as well. We thought we have a model, we tested it, let's do it, and this is impact. But then another one comes along with another model and could theoretically show the exact opposite to it. And that causes, that's a problem. But what they did in here, they did a smart thing. They tried some bootstrapping analysis to get something out of this noise. We maybe can see some of these colors behind there, which is a sort of a certainty band saying of what will happen without adaptation. There will be a slight decrease. But with adaptation, which what we know in adaptation, there could be, with these increases, still a positive response to climate change, because there are ways to adapt to it. So there's much more to it. The point I like to make in here is that there has been many studies which don't tell us of how much uncertainty is in there. We just can feel there's a lot of uncertainty in there, but we can't quantify it the way we went about it, including this.
I was curious about the studies that include adaptation. I was just wondering if you could say how does that incorporate it into the models that you were describing before?
They distinguish between them, which is good, because adaptation will give you a different response. But again, with or without adaptation, they still seem to be all over the place. Adaptation would be you sow earlier or later to avoid something, or you grow a crop which has a different sensitivity to some stress. So there are certain ways we can adapt, and I think the most simplest one is changing when you do your sowing time, for instance.
How does the model factor in, for instance, change in the sowing time or some such thing, which is highly specific?
So within each, these are individual studies. These are individual published studies from the literature, which they summarized all and put this out. So you would need to go back to see what adaptation they did here. Was it the sowing time? Was it, I think some of them applied irrigation as an adaptation. Was it changing the characteristics of the crop? We don't know. And again, whatever they do, and someone else might have done the same thing with another model, which would mean there's some uncertainty in this. Again, the point I want to make in here, we don't know how much is due to uncertainty and how much is due to variability. There's some natural variability in there. You would expect things responding differently at different parts, different points in the world. Let me move on. Some of you might have seen this communication from Lehmann and Rillick, which which I like, because they try to look at impacts in relation to if people would take action and do something about it. So if you have, for instance, a large impact, then you try actually to do some adaptation. If the impact is very small, you wouldn't do too much. But on top of it, you still have to deal with your impact with these two kinds of variation. One is the unexplained one, which is uncertainty, and one is the explained one. So if you have a large uncertainty and large variability, but they make it very clear you need to distinguish between them, people often decide not to do anything about it because it's too uncertain for them. Whereas when you can reduce these two things and you become more certain about the impact, what's going on, then policymakers are more willing to do something about it. What they also say, so the big point in here, you have an impact, and in addition to the impact, there are two components. One is the variability. If you grow a crop, for instance, at 2 different points with 2 different soils, they will respond differently. This is natural variability. If you use one model here and one model here, you get a different answer, and this different answer will be due to the uncertainty in your models. I think I say that again, due to model processes, measurement errors, and you have some variability, natural variability within space and time, which is there and which will probably even increase. That's why I think it's important to differentiate. They didn't show us this figure, but they talk about it, that over time, by understanding the system better, we probably are able to reduce the uncertainty, the errors in our models in terms of our inputs and the way we do the processes. We're getting closer to reality to it. But at the same time, we are likely to increase the natural variability because we are able to run the model at different points under different situations, for different soils, for different management, and so on. So the variability will not go away. We hope over time the uncertainty will be reduced by knowing more about the system. But by being more sophisticated, we might increase natural variability by being able to consider more situations, more soils, more points, and so on. And I think there is some interaction between this as well. The uncertainty of model outputs are not constant. They depend also on where you are in the landscape, and you will see that in a moment. That gets me to the actual talk there after 1 hour. To AgMIP wheat, where in general, crop models are the main tools to assess climate change impact. You mentioned statistical models, but because of the dynamical changes and feedbacks interactions, in general, it's acknowledged that crop models are the main tool to understand, to hopefully help us to understand what will happen with climate change in agriculture. But the big question is, how much of the simulated effects are due to the models? I showed you before this big spread of data. A large proportion is likely due to just using a different model. That means it's very uncertain. It's very hard to take any actions on it. We published a paper. On the next slides, I will want to show you. That's a paper I sent you around on uncertainty and simulating wheat yields under climate change. You can see again, a lot of people have helped sort of putting these things together. Once by having the individual groups running the models for us in a very sort of controlled way. And in addition, sort of helping to understand of how we actually can analyze this data. So in this pilot study, I will show you we had 27 wheat models. I said we are now up to 30 models. We looked at 4 contrasting field experiments, which sort of to represent natural variability and to see what are the interactions with this. We supplied standardized protocols where every model had to do the same things in a very sort of narrow focused way, so that we really can pin down of what's coming due to using a different model. But we also did some other interesting things in between where we didn't supply all the data to the models. We said, look, we only give you the input data. We tell you a bit about the crop, but you don't see all the data. And which we call a blind test. And then a second, and we asked them to do certain exercises to be able to compare this. Then we went to a full calibration where we supplied all the field experiments to allow them to calibrate their model to these particular experiments. And as I said, we carried out a bunch of sensitivity analysis across these two different approaches. In this, these are the different groups. These are the different environments we considered. We picked them for different reasons to be very different, but according to CIMMYT mega environments, by picking these environments, we were able to represent other environments in the world as well. For instance, a classic example, most of the breeding for India is happening actually in northwest Mexico because of very similar climates. That's where CIMMYT has one of the main research stations to breed for this environment. But you can see this environment is repeated in other environments, in other areas as well. So by doing this, can't remember the number, we were thinking that by having just 4 points, we could say something about what's happening for, I think, half of the wheat growing areas in the world. Green sort of indicates where wheat is growing quite a bit in the US and Canada, Europe, China, a bit down in Australia and Argentina. There's one reason we don't have any wheat model in Africa is there's very little wheat grown at the moment in Africa. And what we did is we basically asked them to simulate certain things, and then and these would be simulations for biomass for, I don't know, probably Holland, for the Netherlands. And then we, afterwards, when we were at the blind one, we put the observed data there, and you could see already here, and that comes back again, that some models were amazingly close to some of these points. Others might have been much further off of some of these observations. We are very interested in yields. We did other things as well, but let's concentrate on yields, where we, again, for the 4 different locations, Netherlands, Argentina, India, and Australia, just get your head around the different way of looking at showing the yields this way, grain yields. The average wheat yield in the world is about 3 tons. So we have a yield from below and from well above average wheat yield. So we representing a large range of growing conditions by just picking these 4 locations. For one of them, we had error bars, because even this is just a point. There's uncertainty in also measuring things in the field.
One shot, is it just 1 year, or is it a whole time series of data?
It's only, we had experiments, with some of them went over different years. We picked one treatment from 1 year only, which was representative for current situations in this environment. Then under the blind test, where the modelers did not know the yield, for instance, we taught them, we gave them some help with the phenology. We gave them all the initial conditions, the weather data, the soil characteristics. We asked them to simulate it, and then we looked afterwards at the simulation in relation to the observations. And in this case, these are the simulated yields. This would be 50% of the simulated yields within the box. This would be 80% between the whiskers, and there would be some outliers. And you can see here already, without them knowing the end result, that the median comes actually relatively close in most situations, shown here, to the observer. That might be a bit off in Australia. If you then give them all the observed data and allowed them to calibrate, you can see that the yields coming much closer together. There's still some variability, which sort of was encouraging that people not just over-tuning or fitting their models to this particular data. And now it becomes even more clear that the median of this comes very close to the observed data point. I think with the median, sometimes it's median or average, that seems to hold not just for the yield data, it seems to also holding for other parts of the system, like biomass data, nitrogen uptake data, ET data. Another interesting aspect in here, distinguishing between blind, the yellowish one, and the fully calibrated results, showing you the models, the numbers of models which were below a general field experimental error. There has been a study by Taylor 15, 16 years ago where they looked across the globe through agriculture experiment, agronomic experiment, and breeding experiments. And there's a lot of variability of how you can measure things, but in average across these different studies, the field error seems to be around 13%. Our motivation in here was you can't be better than what you can measure in the field. This is error in the field. Let's take this as a threshold and see how well these models do in relation to this threshold. How many models come below this threshold? Under a blind situation for the single location, you see they did much better for the higher yielding environments compared to, for instance, Argentina and Australia. Then we looked at numbers of models which did well in different locations, up to combining all. You can see there was not one single model which was below this threshold in all 4 locations. So there also seem to be models better for certain locations than other locations. There's not a model which is good for Netherlands, performs also best in India or in Australia. When we calibrated, obviously we got much more models underneath there. There's still some missing, which is okay. And we now have some models which are also able to simulate within this error across these different locations. You've seen this one. So we looked at different components. That's just an example for biomass. The top one is for yield. Blind again is the whole bar, and fully calibrated is the blue one, which is sort of overlying on the blind one. You can see there seemed to be a tendency when we made all the data available that people look closer to their yields because that's where the biggest improvement happened, whereas other aspects were less improved. But in general, all of the simulations in relation to this data improved when we made all the data available to them. Model detail. We talked also this morning, which I really liked, how much detail you need. And it really depends on to whom you talk. If you have people really into the area, they say, if you don't have this detail, don't forget about simulating that. And they want all their details represented in there. They see it's the only way towards better models. We try to look at them. We were not totally successful, but it does follow the general understanding of complexity within models. We try to quantify how detailed models are by asking them how many genetic parameters they have. If they have a lot of genetic parameters, they are very complicated, a lot of detail in there. If there's less, they're very simplistic, very simple models. And then we related this towards how well they did in terms of errors related to the yields at the 4 different locations. And what you can see with a very poor R-square, it does follow with a very poor correlation this sort of general trend. If you are too simple, where you miss processes, then your model won't be able to get close to the observation. But if you have too many parameters, if you have too many processes in there, which all generate their own errors in terms of calibrating them there, you have too much detail, you also move away into the area where the errors increase. So somewhere in between, in this middle part, seems to be the right area of how much complexity, how many parameters you need for describing a cropping system. Again, it's a very poor relationship. Just look at the low R-square, but in general, it seems to follow the classic approach that with more detail, you also increase errors which just accumulate due to many more parameters in the system. I thought this is an interesting I felt it was an interesting analysis, but it's also quite complex. Let me try to take you through. We started with the blind. We look at the 4 different locations: Netherlands, Argentina, India, and Australia. We look not at the impact. We run a scenario, a late century scenario, A2. In this graph, we're not looking at the impact. We look at the variability in relation to the impact. So how much the models disagree with what they simulate. If you have a large CV, then they start disagreeing. If you have a narrow CV, they're all agreeing on something. If you look at the blind background, where they had not calibrated their model to these locations, you can see there's a CV of 20, 20, 25, and particularly for Australia goes up to 30. If we now allow them to calibrate, in general, it seems to that the CV in all these locations comes down a bit. If we now consider the 50% models with the closest simulation to the observed yield across all locations, we rank the models. These are the best models we have in relation to representing the data. Do we get a narrow error? In fact, the error goes up again in actually most of the situation, particularly in here. If we now take the 50% models with the closest simulation per location, remember that they varied between locations. One model was good at this location, but not good at this location. These are now the best models for this location. They seem to be the best, reducing sort of the uncertainty, the errors from the models in these 3 locations, but not for Australia, even increases. So what does that mean? I think it means that the best model, that means which have the smallest root mean square error in relation to the observed data, have the smallest CV at 3 locations, but not in Australia. But just by having the best model doesn't guarantee you that you get the best, the lowest uncertainty in terms of climate change impact. So that means the performance of the model with historical data is not necessarily a guidance of how the models will do in terms of the future impact studies, particularly due to this outlier in here. That's a heavy one, so sure. This one here?
Yeah, because root mean squared error, that's with respect to the observation?
Yes.
So that relationship you're showing is actually not the theoretical relation. I think at least, let me just go through my argument and see if you think this might be right. So usually one thinks of that as you increase the number of observations, that you're matched, as you increase the number of parameters, your match to observations gets monotonically better. But then when you take those models and try to do predictions with them or forecasting, that's when you get this relationship where the poor models do worse and the very highly parameterized models do better. So I'm a little confused.
There are 2 different aspects in there. This one in here is for where we compared it with observed data, and I think it's for the blind one, where some of the very detailed models had difficulties simulating the observed data across these different environments. So this is for the observed one. But when you then look at the models which did best at the different locations, there's also no guidance for the future. So it doesn't mean we take the best 50% models or whatever best number of models in terms of how they performed in the past. There's no guidance for the future that they are all closest together when it comes to future projections. Yeah. Then
we've been going for an hour now. So are there any more questions from the participants? Do you want to go to a discussion?